From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. We want to check on the markets as we do every day with Abigail Doolittle. So, Abigail, we got those disappointing jobs numbers. Equity markets are up somewhat, but really I thought what stood up was the 10-year yield, which continues to march up.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with you, David. Bonds are really the story here today. And we're back in this time period when bad news is good news. That disappointing jobs report where less jobs were added the prior month was revised down, showing the strain of this second wave of the virus. Everyone wondering how it's going to impact the economy. Well, just 245,000 jobs were added relative to the expectation of 460,000. And that's down from 638,000 the month before. So there is an early sign of how the second wave. Nonetheless, we do have stocks higher. The S&P 500 up 0.7%. The energy index up nearly 5%. The Russell 2000, another all-time high, not just for that index, but the other indexes up 1.7%. Banks flying. So the reflation trade is in place. And that goes right to your point on bonds, David, because right now we have the 10-year yield backing up 6 basis points on the week, up about 14 basis points. The worst week for bonds going all the way back to August. Bonds selling off. That, of course, pushes yields higher on the idea that there is some kind of recovery, reflation happening here around the stimulus. It's going to be interesting to see whether or not the 10-year yield, though, can break out of this year's range.
Yeah, we will have to watch that carefully. Thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. Well, we knew that the jobs numbers wouldn't reflect all of the recent COVID surge, but we did not necessarily expect them to be showing some downward trend even before the COVID came back, roaring back. To take us through what the numbers may indicate about the path forward, welcome now Douglas Holtz-Eakin. He is president of American Action Forum. He earlier served as the director of the Congressional Budget Office as well as chief economist of the President's Council of Economic Advisors under President George W. Bush. So, Doug, great to have you back with us. They were disappointing on the downside. How much should we read into that?
I think the real significant piece is over on the household survey. I mean, this is a weak jobs number, and some of it might be seasonal adjustment, and we could always wait for another month and see if that squares out. But the household survey showed a big decline in labor force participation, and that's a really troubling development. We have, 4 million people who simply have not come back into the labor force compared to February, and that's the sign of the virus really getting in the way of the supply side of the economy. People can't get to work. They can't go out and conduct economic commerce, and so that's the real hit.
And sadly, it's possible we ain't seen nothing yet because, as economists keep pointing out, these numbers really were effective in the middle of November, right?
Yes. Yeah. This is the survey week was the week of the 12th, and so we really saw a big spike after this, and you would expect when we get the December numbers, we're going to see a real impact from the virus.
So what does this say about the need for further stimulus? Obviously, that is really pending right now in Washington. There was some progress apparently made yesterday. Maybe there's a compromise afoot based on that bipartisan proposal of the Senate. What does it say about the need for that?
I think prior to this report, there was a good case to be made that some additional support for the economy was necessary. Might not really be stimulus, but we've got a lot of long-term unemployed. We've got the expiration of the UI programs at the end of the year, the rent and mortgage forbearance. So there's some headwinds that were predictable, and you probably wanted to do something on the basis of that. This strengthens that case, and so one hopes it also changes the politics somewhat to move people toward getting over the finish line. That hasn't happened yet, but I think these data should encourage lawmakers to get a deal.
Doug, there's a fair amount of talk about a so-called K-shaped recovery, that some people are doing better and some people are doing significantly worse. Does that carry over into jobs? Are a lot of the jobs that are being lost or are not coming back disproportionately in the lower income areas and also minorities?
Yes, we can see that in some of the real-time data that we've sort of picked up recently. And at the onset of the recession, what we saw was the loss of service business in high-income zip codes. But the workers in those service jobs were low-income workers, and in the recovery, we've seen the high-income places come back, but the low-income workers are not, and it's disproportionately communities of color and low-skilled workers, and that really is a troubling part of this recovery.
A good part of 2020 has been occupied with this back and forth between Republicans and Democrats up on the Hill about how much more stimulus is needed. With Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, initially starting, I think it was $3.3 trillion, coming down off that number. We have Mitch McConnell saying $500 billion is enough. Looking back now, did the Republicans have a point? Would we have made a mistake, perhaps, if we had really put forward $3.3 trillion last May?
I think the real issue is what is in the package more than the size of the package. You can always go back and provide additional funds if they prove to be necessary. It's really, are you getting at the core elements, right? There's nothing we can do with money to get high-income individuals to go back to those services. They're not going to fly, go to hotels, go to concerts unless it's safe. And so you're not going to replace that. What you do have to do is replace the income of the people who worked in those industries. That's a key issue. You do have to take care of the schools and to some extent the states and localities. And you probably have to do some things Republicans are talking about in terms of business liability protections to really get the economy to take off when the virus is gone. So I think what's in it is more important than the size. And certainly, given what we've seen in the CARES Act, some of that money just never went out, right? Notably things at the Fed and the Treasury. And so the size didn't make a difference there. It was what was needed, and we had the wrong things.
It's interesting. One of the things I'm a little confused about, there's money that hasn't gone out, as you said. We keep hearing about that from the White House. I question why it hasn't gone out, and it takes us actually to the back and forth between Steven Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, and the senators this week about whether he should have asked for that money back from the Fed. You've written a piece actually suggesting that the numbers really indicate that they didn't need that money.
Yeah, these were about $500 billion of money given to the Treasury to backstop so-called facilities at the Fed, lending facilities. And those facilities were absolutely necessary in March when they were set up. We saw credit spread spike. There was enormous liquidity distress in the markets. They weren't functioning very well. And it was unthinkable that someone could go into those markets and borrow. And so set up a Main Street lending facility for firms, a municipal liquidity facility for states and localities, and a variety of others for commercial businesses. And it worked. It worked beautifully. If you look now, even with the announcement that the facilities are going away, there's been no increase in the spreads. The markets are functioning perfectly, and we've gotten no use out of the Main Street lending facility. No one's gone there, or the municipal liquidity facility, because they can get credit in well-functioning credit markets. And so these facilities have worked. They've done their job, but they don't need to stick around.
So let's come back to that proposal, the bipartisan proposal, because that's the basis on which Democrats and Republicans are negotiating right now. We've got number one, small business money, a fair amount, $280 billion, something like that. We've got a fair amount for states, like $160 billion, I think it is, plus some for education. Is it addressing the issues that you think need to be addressed for the sake of the economy, at least to bridge us forward to a time when we have a vaccine?
I think that's exactly right. And I would encourage the Congress to pass this. I think they should get an A, no other grade, for what they did with the CARES Act. They can, again, in a bipartisan way, do the right thing on behalf of Americans and the economy. And it's a bridge to the vaccine. There are probably 6 good months before widely available vaccinations have done the trick, and we need to have some support during those 6 months.
Okay, Doug, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you very much. That's helpful. It's American Action Forum President Douglas Holtz-Eakin. Coming up, the view from the front lines of the COVID-19 crisis with Dr. Mark Boom, Houston Methodist Medical Center President and CEO. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. President Trump's plan to campaign in Georgia for 2 Republican candidates for the Senate has sparked concern within the party that the president's efforts could backfire. Mr. Trump has repeatedly alleged that widespread fraud cost him victories in Georgia and other key states, and he's disparaged the state's most prominent Republicans. Republicans fear that could divide the party and suppress votes for Senators David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler. The UK is warning that Brexit trade talks are at a very difficult point. The atmosphere got worse last night when British officials accused the European Union of introducing new demands at the 11th hour. A spokesman for British Prime Minister Boris Johnson told reporters that, quote, time is in very short supply. America's top infectious disease expert says there was never a question that he would accept President-elect Biden's offer to serve as his chief medical officer. Dr. Anthony Fauci told NBC today that yes, he said yes, quote, right on the spot. Dr. Fauci has urged rigorous mask wearing and social distancing practices that have not often been followed at the White House. Mr. Biden says he'll ask Americans to commit to 100 days of wearing masks as one of his first acts as president. Next summer's Olympics in Tokyo will cost at least an extra $2.5 billion because of the COVID-19 pandemic and could go as high as $2.8 billion. The costs include fees to rebook facilities and pay additional staff wages, as well as virus testing and other measures at the event to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. Polls show the Japanese public is divided on whether to hold the Olympics or postpone the games further. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, we always thought there would be a second wave of COVID-19, but I'm not sure that all was expected it to come this fast and this hard. For a view from the front lines, we welcome now Dr. Mark Boom, President and CEO of Houston Methodist, the largest medical center in the Houston area and one of the most respected ones in the country. So, Doctor, welcome back. It's really great to have you with us. Last time we dealt with this, last spring, it was all a question of, are we putting too much pressure on the hospitals? Can they keep up with it? Where are we this time? What is the level of pressure on your hospital and the medical center down there?
Well, we've been through a lot this year, obviously, and in Houston, our biggest surge still remains the June-July timeframe, which was quite troublesome and difficult. Now we have gone up quite a bit as well. So we're at the highest level we've seen since the end of July, when we were coming off that other surge. To put that in perspective, we have about 2,300 beds across our system. In July, we got up to about 800, 850 being used for COVID. Right now, we're sitting at about 430, 450. But we had gotten as low as 140 back in mid-September as we came back down. So it's gone up significantly, and we're very concerned about the trajectory that we continue to be on.
What about ICU beds? A lot of talk about ICU beds, and I understand it's not a fixed number. It can go up or down to some extent as you reallocate other facilities. But if we change the way we treat the disease now, so it's not as likely you'll go into ICU.
That's exactly right. Even in that for what in Houston was kind of a second surge in June, July, we saw that we used a lot less ICU than we did in the early days of this. And we're using even less now as a percentage. So that has been very good. So thankfully, ICU capacity is still doing okay. In fact, most of our growth continues to be in the acute care setting, the kind of regular beds with shorter lengths of stay. So patients who do need hospitalization are getting better quicker, and fewer of them need ICU. Now, when they do get to ICU, though, we see some amazingly sick people. And that's just a very key thing for people to understand. We have a whole bunch of people on what's called ECMO, which are essentially, think of it as an artificial lung machine that they're on to do the work of their lungs, because their lungs are completely wiped out at that point in time. Those patients stay with us for very extended periods of time. And of course, unfortunately, we see a significant amount of mortality in that group. So there's still some very, very sick people. But thankfully, we've been able to prevent a lot of people. And now we have some good news on the front end with the monoclonal antibodies in the outpatient setting, hopefully turning on and decreasing the number of people needing to be hospitalized. We're very hopeful of that.
Dr. Boom, talking about the capacity of the hospitals, do we have a different and perhaps more dangerous situation today than we did back in July, for example, where back in the spring and going into the summer, it tended to be a specific location in the United States that really was a hotspot, maybe two or three. Right now, it seems to be right across the country as you look at these maps. And what does that say about the ability of one facility to help out another?
Yeah, it's a very difficult situation, of course. I mean, on one hand, what that means when we see these record numbers across the United States is that by and large, we're seeing everybody has come up at the same time. And then there are some obvious clear hotspots, in Texas, El Paso and some of the Panhandle area are great examples of that. But what we were able to rely on this summer when we were, kind of in that limited area that was surging is we had lots of traveling nurses come in, really wonderful people who came in and helped extra staffing. And the reality is most of those people have been distributed out to some of the hotspots that are at present. And as we continue to all rise, it's not realistic to believe that they'll be there, to serve the whole country. So that is a definite unique challenge that we will continue to see as this continues to go up. We really need to work together as a population to to level off this curve, bring it back down, and get to the light at the end of the tunnel when vaccines will really begin kicking in. And that's a lot of good news coming up, but it's going to be several months before we see the impact of that. And so we need to get through this winter together.
And how much visibility do you have, as a practical matter, Dr. Boom, into the future? I took a peek at some of the numbers this morning, and I think that you've got positivity around 7% or something. And also your R naught is like 1.15.
Yeah, that's across all of the Texas Medical Centers, so all of our institutions together. Both of those are correct. Actually, at our institution, we're a little higher on the positivity rate, and it's been going up day after day, but at a little bit less steep rate than what we saw in June. So I take some comfort in that things have not just shot wildly out of control. You know, the flip side is, because we've got months ahead of us, you know, they can still get to that same endpoint or even worse if they keep ratcheting up. I attribute that to the fact that we are doing a much better job for masking in our society. In Houston, you know, back in June, really there was still so much debate and not many people wearing them. Now it's pretty good in our community. There's still obviously discussion and debate and misinformation out there, but in a much better situation. What we're seeing is it's unstructured environments where people let their guards down that we see the virus spread. So oftentimes social events in homes, gatherings of individuals. It's much less been in what I would consider a structured environment, certainly a hospital or a school or, you know, going to a supermarket. And that is a really important lesson for all of us, because we have to have the patience, we have to have the vigilance, we have to just see the fact that, you know, a few months out, the light at the end of the tunnel is there, but we have to work together to make sure that we just sort of steel ourselves to a tough few months, and a few months where we all make mutual sacrifice to protect each other and keep this in control.
You've told us before, Dr. Boom, how important it is to wear a mask. We now have the president-elect of the United States saying that he's going to come in and say for the first 100 days of his presidency, he would like all Americans to wear masks. Does that make sense?
Oh, it makes complete sense, assuming the levels are at, or, you know, that we're still dealing with the pandemic, which we will be by then, obviously. We've been urging masking from almost the beginning. The medical community really, you know, frankly got it wrong. And that's part of the challenge we've had very early on. But you've been hearing very consistent messages and then building and building and building evidence since really the April timeframe across the country. We saw this in Houston when we put the mask order in place when things were wildly out of control. And we finally had that in place on July 3rd. We peaked, we crested, and we came down to very low levels. We can get this in control if we have people adhere to those best practices. They're the next best thing to a vaccine. And while we are starting to vaccinate, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, it's going to take a long time to get to everybody in the population, and certainly to dramatically change the dynamics we see in terms of hospitalizations.
Well, let's follow up on that just for a moment. There's a light at the end of the tunnel. Do we know how long that tunnel is? Do we know how bright that light is? Because as I understand it, right now, the Pfizer vaccine, you need 2 doses, and there's like 8 weeks, isn't there? No, 28 days, 4 weeks? How long is there between the two doses?
Yeah, so with Pfizer, it's a 3-week period. So, you know, if you get the vaccine, you know, today, 3 weeks from now, you would get the second vaccine. And then realistically, from what, you know, all the experts are telling us, you know, you're talking full immunity 3-4 weeks after that. So roughly what I'm telling people, and certainly what we're looking at for our staff, is if we get you vaccinated, you know, somewhere around the 17th, 18th, 19th of this month, which we think is very, very possible, hopefully, for many of our staff, you know, you're looking at Valentine's Day, basically, when you would have a likelihood of full immunity. But it's not a golden ticket. And that's going to be one of the really important messages that we have to make sure everybody hears. Until we dial this back and get to where vaccines at an extremely low level in our community, masking, social distancing, other things are going to be necessary. And just because, you know, let's say I may have gotten a vaccine or you may have gotten a vaccine, it's not going to, it shouldn't give you the license to then go places, be without a mask, etc., for a variety of reasons. First and foremost is practically, you'll never know who's been vaccinated and not vaccinated when you're in a group, and whether, you know, you're being exposed to somebody who's unmasked because they're protected versus, you know, not, and just not wearing a mask. But the other reason is right now we know that the vaccines prevent disease. So they prevent people from getting sick at 94, 95% efficacy. We don't yet know. We think it'll be this case, and we hope to get those data later, but we don't know that it prevents infection. And so the difference is you could still have the virus but not get sick from it. So we don't yet know that by being vaccinated, I can't possibly possibly be a carrier and give it to someone else. So we're going to need to continue these things on into the future, likely the first half of the year. 100 days after inauguration actually, gets you towards the end of April, if my math is right. That's probably about right. I suspect it's going to be a little longer than that, but I do think that is a good message to get some unity around all of us doing the right thing.
Doctor, it's so terribly helpful to have you. It's always so informative. Thank you. It's Dr. Mark Boom. He is Houston Methodist President and CEO. And a programming note now, Wall Street Week will air tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. We're joined by Larry Summers and Jillian Tett to talk about the big events of the week, how they have affected global Wall Street. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Time now for Stock of the Hour. We are looking at Carnival and, for that matter, the travel industry. And Abigail Doolittle is here with a look.
Well, David, it's really pretty interesting because Carnival on the day is certainly higher. This after the company yesterday gave an update saying that they will be cruising again in 2021. Somewhat vague, but nonetheless, you have the stock up about 2%. However, the real gains over the last few weeks, David, and not just for Carnival, but for other travel-related stocks as well, such as Norwegian, American, United Airlines. And as you can imagine, this has everything to do with the vaccine reality, the optimism that folks will be back out there at some point in 2021, and that maybe there will even be pent-up demand for travel. The juxtaposition that is so interesting here, though, David, is we had this disappointing payrolls report today, really showing the first signs of what the resurgence of the virus meant, at least in the month of November. Payrolls coming in at 245,000 versus the expectation of 460,000, and down from the prior month in October of nearly 640,000 jobs. And a lot of those jobs in the travel sector, airline workers, cruise line operator workers, the unemployment above 27 weeks really absolutely extended as there's this big population of folks, again, many in that travel industry as they remain unemployed. So again, you have the juxtaposition of these stocks soaring and yet this real world difficulty. It's hard to get your mind around, but that is what's happening right now. A piece of it, though, David, really just has to do with the stock piece because, of course, these travel stocks beaten down on the year. There are other sectors that are beaten down too, such as energy, financials, industrials. Over the last few weeks, and the hope that this would be a reopening, reflation, the trade, you see these sectors really starting to gain as investors are looking for the catch-up of those sectors that had been so beaten down, including the travel stocks, David.
Yeah, and as you told us earlier, Abigail, that reflation is indicated right now by the 10-year as you look at it. So thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the travel industry. Up next, the key Georgia Senate runoff races with former aide to President George Herbert Walker Bush, Joe Watkins, about what's going on down in Georgia, what will make the difference between whether the Republican incumbents hold their seats or not. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, although the prospects for a pandemic relief package before the end of the year are growing, legislators got a stark warning today about the potential cost of inaction. A much weaker than expected November employment report showed thousands of Americans left the labor force amid the spread of COVID-19. National Economic Council Director Larry Kudlow told Bloomberg the jobs numbers are not as bad as they seem.
It may have come in a wee bit under expectations, but I don't know what that means. 6.7% unemployment rate is big news. The CBO and others didn't expect single digits until early 2021. So we got the single digits the last couple of months.
And Mr. Kudlow says the White House wants a targeted stimulus plan. House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer says the House has enough votes to override a veto by President Trump of a crucial defense bill over his demand that it include a provision to strip a legal shield for social media platforms. The National Defense Authorization Act, that, among many things, authorizes military pay raises and extra pay for troops on dangerous missions, has broad support in both the House and the Senate. It's set to pass both chambers next week. It has become law every year for the past 59 years. President Trump has raised $495 million since mid-October, with more than $207 million of it pouring in after Election Day. That's an unusually large amount to raise after an election. Much of the money probably will go into Save America, a political action committee that the president can use for various activities after he leaves office. Some of the contributions will go toward what is left of Mr. Trump's legal fights over the certification of election results. Lebanon's Hezbollah says it is suing a former lawmaker and a website affiliated with a Christian political party for defamation. They've accused the Shiite militant group of being responsible for a massive explosion at Beirut's port this past summer. Washington considers Hezbollah a terrorist group and has been escalating sanctions against it. That blast killed more than 200 people and wounded more than 6,000. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. A month from tomorrow, the voters of Georgia will determine which party will control the Senate as they go to the polls in those two Senate runoff elections. President-elect Biden won the state by just 13,000 votes last month, leaving the outcome in both of those elections very much up in the air. Welcome now the Reverend Joe Watkins, who served in the White House of George Herbert Walker Bush. He now hosts the regular streaming program State of Independence, which you can find at joewatkins.org, and it's produced by Lighthouse TV. So, Reverend Joe, thank you so much for being back with us. Tell us about the race in Georgia. Normally, you'd say a Senate race in Georgia, it's going to go to the Democrats, but things seem to be changing in that state.
Well, we saw, of course, what happened with regard to the presidential election in Georgia, and Georgia has been a reliably red state for quite some time now. But clearly, things are changing. The successful drive to register new voters, new Democrats especially, has had a significant impact. And if you look at the latest polls in that race, David, the latest polls as of this week show Warnock with a 5-point lead over Kelly Loeffler, a 7-point lead over Kelly Loeffler, and Ossoff just narrowly leading Purdue by a couple of percentage points. So turnout is really going to matter in this race. And if Republicans continue to fight with President Trump over whether or not Republican voters should show up to vote on Election Day, January 5th, that's going to have a huge impact in this race.
So talk to us about that voter registration drive. As I understand it, Stacey Abrams, who ran for governor down there, was one of the people behind that. But there's a group actually of African-American women, black women, who've really been driving this down there. Is there a big shift in the participation of black voters in Georgia?
Yes. Well, Tracy Abrams and the other women that worked with her were enormously successful in their bid to register new voters, and that's going to have a huge impact going forward. It did in this race, certainly in the presidential race this past November, and it's certainly going to have an impact on January 5th. And there's nothing holding back the new voters from voting. I think they're just as excited about voting in the January 5th runoff as they were in the November presidential race. The challenge this time will be whether or not Republicans show up to vote, given what has been said by some of President Trump's people in Georgia who are still saying that the election was stolen from them.
Yeah, there's still a lawsuit going on, as I understand, that could interfere with the runoff elections brought by some of the lawyers representing President Trump. As someone who served in a Republican president's White House, is it a good thing or a bad thing that President Trump is going down there? If the goal is to get people to turn out to vote, there was a time he thought they really motivated people, but he keeps saying that it's all a fraud.
Well, it depends on whose eyes you see it from. If you're the president, this is a good thing for him because anything he can do to keep his base motivated and solidified helps him, of course, going forward. He's raised over $200 million since the election, which is really that's an amount that I don't think any other president has raised post-election, especially after a loss. But he's managed to do it. So this helps him greatly to keep his base motivated and giving. I don't know that it helps Republicans necessarily, especially if his message on Saturday is not for them to turn out in big numbers to vote for Purdue and Loeffler. If he says anything less than that, I think it ends up being a loss for Republicans.
So a lot of people think over time that Americans genuinely liked divided government. Does that cut against the Democrat candidates right now down in Georgia? Because it's clear that how they vote in this on these two Senate runoff seats will determine whether Democrats or Republicans control the Senate. They already have the House and they have the White House.
That's absolutely right. But, all politics are local, David, and it depends on what's happening in a particular state and in a particular season. And if this were any other time other than this year and this season, and also with this president, I would give you one answer. But given all that's going on, I would say that anything is possible going forward. And it's very, very possible that on January 5th, you could have two Democrats elected to the U.S. Senate, which would basically give Joe Biden everything he needs to move legislation going forward once he begins his term as president.
Boy, a lot riding on that election, no question about it. Thank you so much to Joe Watkins. He's former aide to President George Herbert Walker Bush. Coming up, part of the impetus for the fiscal stimulus is the dramatic state of food insecurity in this country. We talked with the head of the largest hunger relief organization in the United States of America, Claire Babineaux-Fontenot of Feeding America. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Food insecurity was a major and often overlooked problem in the United States even before the pandemic hit. And COVID has made things that much worse. Welcome now, Claire Babineaux-Fontenot. She is CEO of Feeding America, the largest food relief organization in the country, incorporating 200 food banks and 60,000 food pantries and meal programs across the country. So thank you so much for being with us. It's a terribly important issue, one that we just don't pay enough attention to. Give us a sense of the situation in the country, both pre-pandemic and after the pandemic.
Well, first, let me thank you for having me on. I think it's so important that everyone understand that not only are we right in the middle of a health crisis, we also have a food crisis that's come along with it. You mentioned before the pandemic, and I'll talk about something that you know a whole lot about, which is the economic downturn of 2008. Coming out of that downturn, rates of food insecurity went close to 50 million, somewhere in that vicinity. And it took 10 years, a whole decade, to get back to pre-recession rates of food insecurity. We had just gotten there in 2018 when it had gotten to 37 million. Then it was at 35 million in 2019. I know all of us would agree that's 35 million too many, but we were making progress. As a result of this pandemic, we estimate that those numbers are going to soar back to somewhere around 50 million people. I mean, that's 1 out of 6 individuals, 1 out of 4 kids. And that's an average, though, David. There are counties in this country where 1 out of 2 children is food insecure. I mean, it's a really desperate situation for a lot of people. One other quick data point before we move on is, and the people who are turning to us for help, so many of them never before relied upon the charitable food system. 40% on average, the people who are turning to us for help, never before thought in their wildest dreams that they needed to rely upon the charitable food system to feed their families. So that's the state that we're in right now.
So the question obviously is what we do about it. But first, what is causing it? People being out of work? Is that what it is? They just have lost their income so they can't afford food?
Well, there are a combination of reasons. Some of them are deep and systemic. As you might imagine, vulnerable communities are made even more vulnerable by this food pandemic, by the food crisis. So we have generational poverty at play for so many of the people who turn to us for help. Among those who are coming to us who had not relied upon us before, these are largely people who were right there on the brink. We talk about it in this country that we are a paycheck to paycheck society. We know that the Federal Reserve Bank said that the average American probably can't handle about a $400 cash emergency. So you have so many people who are right there on the brink of poverty, right there on the brink of food insecurity. When they started losing their jobs, they started losing ways to feed their families, and we're seeing them show up. A lot of them were former volunteers, so they were on the other side of that line, And now they're there in need of help to provide for their own families.
So give us some sense of what can be done about this. I mean, first, feed people, which is what you're very involved in doing. We need more volunteers. We need more people contributing. But what really can be done in the short and the medium term?
Absolutely. So you started where I would recommend. Feeding America is a network that you defined earlier, but something else to give context. Since this pandemic started, we've had remarkable outpouring of support for our work. As a result, from March 1st to October 31st, with the help of people like those in your audience and the remarkable network I'm in, we were able to provide 4.2 billion meals to people in need. The unfortunate thing is that the gap is larger than what we've been able to provide so far. So we need people to continue to invest in the work that we do. If you want to be a part of the national efforts where we have a pulse on where the needs are and we direct those funds, go to feedingamerica.org. COVID-19 fund, 100% of the proceeds go directly into local communities. If you have a particular community that you're interested in helping, go to feedingamerica.org, put in the zip code for that community. The food bank that serves that community will pop up and you go directly to them. You also talk about volunteering. There are certain people, we had historically relied inordinately on seniors as volunteers in our work. Seniors are among the most vulnerable to the health side of this pandemic. Consequently, we're in need of volunteers. If you're able and willing to volunteer, go to those places that I directed before and find a way to step up. And then there certainly are policy interventions that we need. I want to talk about two of them, if I may. The first is SNAP, Supplemental Assistance Program. Sometimes people think about it as food stamps. That program is extraordinarily efficient in making certain that people have access to food. We're asking Congress to increase the amount that people are receiving in SNAP because we know from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics that grocery prices are at a 50-year high. SNAP has not kept pace with that. So that's one thing. Increase SNAP, decrease regulation around SNAP so that more people have access to these benefits. And then the final one that I would say from the policy side is that about last year, we provided 5 billion meals overall as a network. This year, clearly, we're going to provide far more than that. But 1.7 billion of those meals came from U.S. commodities. Those commodities are going to be cut in half without any intervention on the part of the USDA and Congress. Please encourage Congress to act right now to help people.
Well, let's talk about Congress acting right now because we have a proposal on a stimulus bill right now pending in front of Congress. It looks like they're going to try to negotiate through the weekend to get something done. Is there anything for SNAP in there? Is there anything that's going to help this food insecurity crisis?
Well, I hope there's something for SNAP in there. I know that our team and so many others have been working hard to ensure that Congress includes SNAP benefits in whatever it is that they pass. I know this is Bloomberg, so from an economics perspective, also coming out of that economic downturn, something that we learned is not only is it good for people who are in need, but it's also good for the economy. For every $1 invested in SNAP, you get over $1.70 return inside of the economy. So we hope it's in there.
Yep.
We hope it's in there.
Well, that's a good return. No question about that. Thank you so very much for being with us. That's Claire Babineaux-Fontenot. She is Feeding America CEO. Coming up, we're going to go to the White House for its take on the jobs numbers. Tyler Goodspeed, acting chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, joins us. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Jobs numbers out this morning disappointed, slowing the rate of growth even before the worst of the shutdowns happening because of the surge in coronavirus. For the perspective of the Trump administration, we welcome back now Dr. Tyler Goodspeed. He is acting chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Great to have you back with us. Now, I know the unemployment number percentage is 6.7%, a lot better than anybody thought it would be at this point. At the same time, you can't be happy with the fact that we're creating more jobs each month as months go on.
Well, David, we learned this morning that last month the U.S. economy added 344,000 private sector jobs. And as you noted, the unemployment rate ticked down from 6.9 to 6.7%. The jobs gain was lower than expected and certainly lower than we hoped. At the same time, I think it's important to keep these numbers in perspective and in proper context. So these job gains were in the context of 15 states either pausing reopening or outright reimposing lockdown restrictions. These included Illinois, Indiana, Georgia, Massachusetts, some pretty big states. And the second thing is, as you suggested, the perspective of where we've come from. And so if we cast our minds back a few months, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office was projecting a year-end unemployment rate of 11.5%. And we're projecting that unemployment would be 7 million jobs fewer than what we observed in the month of November. So certainly we've exceeded expectations, but as you suggest, there's a ways yet to go.
Well, and the question is, what do we think is between here and there, where the destination is? Because these jobs numbers, as I understand it, were really as of the middle of November, and it looks like there have been more shutdowns since then. We're having a resurgence of the COVID-19. What do you anticipate over the next 2 or 3 months in terms of jobs?
Well, there's no doubt that the reimposition of lockdown restrictions imposes substantial headwinds on the labor market recovery that we've observed to date. And that's why we here in the White House are very much pushing for some Phase 4 relief to provide that bridge to the widespread availability of vaccine candidates in the coming months. And in fact, the positive developments on the vaccine front actually strengthen the case for some near-term fiscal support because it means that if we can just maintain some of those quality employer-employee matches, maintain those the survival of a lot of these small businesses, then we can see the bridge to the widespread availability of the vaccines.
Yeah, and speaking about that bridge, that's a word that you used when you wrote an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal with your colleague Peter Navarro, talking about it as a bridge rather than talking about stimulus, because we're trying to get to that point where we have the vaccine widely distributed. How big a bridge do we need? I mean, I know you're not going to negotiate the deal right now between Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, but something along the lines they're talking about, is that enough, do you think?
Well, we're focused more on policies rather than top-line dollar amounts. And when it comes to policies, some of the priorities that we are emphasizing include a re-up of the highly successful Paycheck Protection Program, the introduction of some liability protection for small businesses, and also some targeted relief for the 10.7 million unemployed Americans, just so that we have that buffer for consumer spending, which is 70% of the U.S. economy. But as I said, if we didn't have, thanks to the Operation Warp Speed, if we didn't have widespread availability of vaccines on the horizon, then there's actually a case to be made that there are going to have to be necessary factory reallocations. Some businesses and sectors are going to have to contract while others expand. But the fact that we have these vaccine candidates in sight actually means that it's even more important to preserve some of these small businesses, to preserve the knowledge and efficiencies that they possess, and to preserve the matches between employers and employees. So that we don't have to go through a costly labor market recovery down the road.
And I certainly can't find anyone who wants to argue with the fact that having that vaccine on the horizon is really good news. We're just hoping that it comes as fast as possible. But at the same time, one of the issues of policy, let's put aside the numbers, as you say, but the policies is support for some state governments, because that's employment as well, isn't it, Tyler, as a practical matter? Because they're having to lay off people.
So one of the things that we observed in the November jobs report is that one of the things that was holding back employment gains was a decline in employment in state and local government education. So the interesting thing there is that while employment in state and local government education increased, it didn't increase by as much as we would ordinarily expect with normal levels of in-person school attendance and school openings. And so certainly we are attentive to the fact that schools and state and local governments may require some additional targeted support to make sure that they hold on to those employees. but we want to make sure that it is targeted and well designed rather than a sort of blank check bailout to states and local governments that were profligate even before the COVID pandemic hit.
Right, but quickly in conclusion here, there is targeting this proposal, as I understand it, when it comes to state government support, because it's only going for things that you've lost revenues from COVID, and it's only to specific states, right? Aren't they trying to target it, this bipartisan group of senators?
Well, I don't want to trespass upon negotiations. Those are ongoing between both houses of Congress, and here at the White House, the economics team, Chief of Staff Meadows, Director Kudlow, Secretary Mnuchin, myself, we're in constant communication. And they're working closely with counterparts on the Hill.
Fair enough. You can't blame a guy for trying, right? Thank you so much to Tyler Goodspeed. He's the acting chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk to former HP CEO Carly Fiorina about passing the baton. That does it for Balance of Power, and this is Bloomberg.